Thank you, Dala, for this incredible exhibit, and thank you all for coming and spending a sunny afternoon with us. We're really grateful. I hope everyone has had a chance to be in the space, but if you haven't yet, we can always add extra context as we go. As Katie mentioned, we'll be going to Q&A sort of in the last third of the time that we have, but I feel very privileged to be in conversation with Dala now, and I guess I have many questions about process, about the ideas that fed into this project, but I think before any of that, I just want to acknowledge that we are having this conversation in a period of utter devastation and utter loss, and holding space for conversations like these is such a luxury in this time, but also a necessity. And in a way, honouring these figures also feels like its own kind of luxury because of the scale of destruction and violence that has been wrought through genocide means that there are so many people we cannot account for and answer or reflect on or cherish. So I guess with that in mind, I was just really curious about what your research process was like and how and why you thought these figures in particular connected with one another.
Well, is this on? Yes, okay. Sorry. First of all, thank you for the very generous introduction, Katie, and thank you so much, Zena, for being a part of this. Well, to go back in time, essentially in May 2021, when the most recent onslaught on Gaza started before the 2023 genocide, I started a really kind of simple act where I used my social media platform as a linked page to wider readings on what was happening, because I felt, I was a student at that time, and I felt that no one was understanding the scale of violence that we were seeing unfold. And it became kind of a community site where everyone would send in links to different films or videos, and it was just being generated all over. And I saw the lack of just the gap in knowledge that was needed for people to understand what we were seeing happening in Gaza at that time. And during that moment, I learned about, I mean, as a Lebanese person who grew up in the aftermath of the occupation of the South and the 2006 war, this scale of violence was not unfamiliar, but it was the first time that I heard of a document called the United States of Arabia, which was championed by Woodrow Wilson, actually, in King Faisal of Iraq, where the idea was that all of the Arab-speaking peoples of the Ottoman Empire, at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, would be nations of the United States of Arabia. And they had the constitution written up, and it was supposed to be a secular state from Syria, Iraq, Lebanon to Palestine. And that got me obviously thinking of where did that kind of direction in history take a complete, left turn? How did we skew so far from Mark, supposedly? And where did that really notion of self-determination even come from? Because obviously it didn't start with King Faisal, and there were so many Arab utopian writings that were coming out of the Nahda in the late 1800s that were so seminal in a formation of a united Arab-speaking identity. And as I was, researching, but also imagining what a different sort of present would look like, the current moment started to make more sense as the dots all started to connect. And I always knew from that sort of moment that there were the beginnings of a work in there. And so from 2021 till now, really, this has been obviously just my own sort of personal research that I'm very grateful as an artist, to have the chance to work with institutions to work on this further. But when the Ghazi genocide started in 2023, it became very clear to me, with the mass amount of death and unmarked graves and unaccounted for individuals that were lost, and the constant grief and mourning that we were all experiencing watching this, as history has continued to repeat itself through all these periods. The need for an understanding of how, this divide and conquer even was befallen on us. And as an artist, you're given this opportunity to, these moments change us, and you have to let them. And in this change, you have to interpret. You have to interpret it. Your job is to interpret it outwardly, through your act of creativity and love and making art. And this very much felt like the only thing I could do with myself, or else I would just have gone insane. And it came also from a very personal moment, since as the genocide continued, and then the 2024 invasion of southern Lebanon occurred, I sat with a very real moment of understanding that my village in southern Lebanon, where my family history lays, all of my sort of remnants of my history were in this one space. And the one thing I could have done with my tools as an artist was to make rubbings of my grandparents' graves, so that if my village was lost, I wouldn't lose my family again through this. And in that moment of, personal sort of regret and reflection, I just knew that this was the work that I had to do. So I said, let's put it on the calendar and let me work towards it, because this sort of gesture and mark making is the only way I know how to make sense of what I was seeing.
So I guess in the research process, how did you decide who to exclude and who to include? Because obviously there are 43 names there, and when we talked, beforehand, you described this work as infinite, that this project could go on. And I was also reflecting on particularly people like Leila Shoa and Atel Adnan, who've passed in more recent years. In a way, they kind of slip from this realm into this next realm and become eligible for this piece of art. And I suppose I'm just really curious as to the curatorial decisions you made of saying, actually, this is someone I'm going to include, or this is someone I'm not going to include.
Yeah, I mean, it could be infinite in the sense that obviously in the last few months we've lost Walid al-Khalidi and Ahmed Kabour, who will be included, I suppose, in future iterations. But the kind of idea of who to include was based on Beirut, as kind of everyone who passed through there at a certain moment, because this sort of geography is extensive and expansive, and the only way to sort of kind of limit it in my capacity as an artist based between Beirut and London is to think of that sort of moment, and everyone's present. It's sort of like the idea, when people ask you if you could have dinner with anyone alive or dead in history, who would you have? Who would you pick to have dinner with? And so I sort of thought about, there used to be this pub in Hamra in Beirut that was very famous, called the Smugglers Inn, which was bombed in the 80s, of course. during the 1982 Israeli invasion, and it used to be a pub where all these artists used to gather, all these artists and thinkers used to gather, show work, and argue, and so it was not so much a cemetery, really. I mean, it is a cemetery, but my idea was to, let's look at all these connections between all these figures, and one name would lead to another through their connections, and so the way that it was narrowed down to 43 was just through kind of linking. For example, Mahdi Amel was introduced to leftist thought through the husband of Bayan Wahid's Al-Hut, basically. So just kind of thinking of how these figures all are, spent their lifetimes sort of amongst each other. But all of this is also to say, obviously, the idea of the martyr is the biggest one, and we see this constantly being played out. And there isn't anyone necessarily that is excluded. Everybody is, essentially. It was just about like linking a moment and thinking about kind of creating this document of marking them that would allow for more connections and for more people to come in, rather than to limit them.
Well, I guess that leads me on to the actual space itself, because I just went now before this conversation. I had so many questions about the cartography of the space. Like, how do you, in a way, cemeteries are obviously the most organic form of spatial creation, right? You never know who's going to die and where. You can buy a plot, but you never know if that person's going to end up in there. And it's from a geographer's perspective, it's like the most ad hoc, informal, unstructured way of commemoration. Obviously, this is an artistic interpretation of that kind of phenomenon, and so I was really interested. And there is a map actually in the guide itself of the gallery, and I was interested in, who do you put next to who? Is there like a cool corner of the cemetery where all the artists are and all the poets are over here? And how did you decide, actually, I want this person beside this person, and this person flows into this person? And could you tell us a bit, maybe more about both the experience of moving through that space, but also the narrative arc, if there is one, of experiencing the gallery in that way?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know exactly who had to go next to who, but I knew that certain people couldn't go next to each other because they had dated and their relationships didn't end very well. And so I wouldn't.
Next to your ex,
I don't think they'd want. I don't think they would have wanted that. But essentially, so as I was working on this, and as I was working on the obituaries, the flow of one who came after the other came through the writing. So, for example, Paul Geragosian had to come before Mona Saudi because he gave her first solo show, and it says that, so the way that people are timed, essentially, who comes first before who, is just like you're following a clear sort of story. For example, here, sorry, I have this sort of linked, so I don't want to make any sort of mistakes here. Okay, so for example, when you read about Mahmoud Darwish's passing, in the very end I say that he wanted to be buried in Galilee, and right after him is Nasri Hajjaj, a filmmaker who worked on his most notable film is about Palestinians who died in exile and wanted to be buried in Palestine. And so the narratives all sort of linked who would come after who, sort of like a bigger story rather than necessarily a timeline, because some, it ends with Mahdi Amel, who passed away in the 80s, but, right before him is someone who passed away. Skandar Habash passed away only a few months before the show opened. So it wasn't based on time. It was just based on the connections of how they all interacted with each other. And I knew that it had to start obviously with the Nahda, and I knew that it had to end with Mahdi Amil, whose writings need to be, well, translated. More of them need to be translated and need to be considered in this very present moment as a writer from southern Lebanon who spoke deeply about resistance and what that meant, and the current reality that we are seeing unfold.
I guess then maybe let's think about grief and what a cemetery... I mean, cemeteries can also be joyful places in a way that they're a space for you to commune with those you've loved and lost, a space to hold your grief and your remembrance. But this, of course, is a different kind of cemetery, and this is a cemetery... I mean, firstly, it's a representation of a cemetery, but also it's a cemetery which is not family-oriented, right? It's driven by a collective grief, and as us, as Arabs, or, you know, each individual subjectivity, seeing these figures and relating to these figures in a particular way. I mean, many of the people in the cemetery and in the booklet that accompanies it are household names if you grew up in an Arab household. So I suppose, how did you think about, I mean, you mentioned it a little earlier, but I'd love to hear more about how you thought about grief in this moment, which is so saturated with grief. In fact, I feel like grief and rage is all we have at the moment, and how to situate that on a collective level and also a historical one, right? Like some of these figures, you know, that they were born in the 1800s, or they lived in an era, you know, they were, I'm forgetting who exactly, but I'm thinking of the female artist whose husband was killed by one of the Ottoman officers. And so, you know, that there is a way to historicize this, but then we're in this moment of collective grief. And so I would love to talk more, I guess, about the connections between present grief and historical grief.
Yeah. That is a very difficult question, I must say, in the sense that, at least personally, I'm trying to make sense of my grief constantly. Allow me to read this. Essentially, really, when I was writing all the obituaries, it felt that was the most difficult moment in producing this work. Every time I would reach, every time I would reach Khalil al-Hawi's death, I would always feel like this is my maximum point of grief. He committed suicide on the eve of the Israeli invasion in 1982, and so he has an unmarked grave. And that is the kind of the most difficult moment for me in the reality of this show, to think that 1982 is constantly being perpetuated. And in looking at all of this grief, and through looking at the lives of all of these figures, I wrote this down, so I'd like to read it. It all goes back to love, because our life will always be a far better and more beautiful thing than this mode of grief that has limited our existence into just a constant resistance to our own genocide. Because we have full lives to live. All of these figures have lived full lives, and we cannot be reduced to simply being the token or anomaly in a space of our existence, you know, because we are always being reduced to these arbitrary lines that have been drawn to divide and conquer us. So, in having to deal with all of this grief that surrounds this work, we are forced to think of that we cannot, you know, to kind of evade the the notion of having to authenticate grief via proximity, in the sense that I do not feel more pain because I'm from the South than you do. And the centrality of identity here that has been drawn upon us, because as we look at the Cemetery of Martyrs and the reality that we are living in, it is very clear that all of these figures could potentially exist as being buried in Greater Israel. And what would then happen of their graves and their lives and their histories? So this refusal of representation through our constant mutilated bodies and mass death and unmarked graves, the only way, sort of to counter this is to think that our love will liberate us. Their love will hopefully, as you read through all of these figures, you will see the amounts of love that they shared with one another, and beyond just homeland in that sort of sense, their existence is a constant practice of love. And so I believe in my language to live in love and demand it as a resistance and a political right and a truth to our lives. Yeah. So that's what I wrote.
I guess, just a reflection that the phrase you just used to not authenticate grief through proximity, actually I think is a meaning of solidarity in a way, because obviously in this country we've seen millions of people marching over 2.5 years, consistently, relentlessly, in defiance of so much censorship and smearing. And it's because we understand grief as not being proximal, and that being the true meaning of solidarity. And so, yeah, I guess there's a beauty to that. I hadn't made that connection before. I guess I do want to talk a bit about the way that the Israeli state, as a necro-political state, operates here, because so many of these obituaries look squarely or begin and end with Israeli settler colonial violence, and whether through displacement in the Nakba, whether through the invasion of Lebanon in the south, even further afield, the fewer but still present Egyptian and Iraqi figures are still sort of implicated in Western imperialism and Israeli presence in the region. And so I guess I'm thinking a bit about how do we make sense of graves in this moment, because it's funny, I'm reading, it's not out yet, but I would recommend everyone pick up a copy when it is. It's called Your Presence is a Danger to Your Life. It's a series of testimonies compiled by Samar Yazbek, and it's out with Fitzgeraldo later this month, but it's testimonies of the genocide. And I think something I had not fully grasped in following the genocide is the attack on the dead, not just the attack on the living, but the way that Israel often unburies the dead, organ harvests, attacks cemeteries, obliterates remains, makes bodies so that there's nothing to be buried, evaporates them, burns them beyond recognition. And so I guess maybe it's a bit of a bleak avenue to go down, but I think it's important because it seems to be, it has such a shadow over this show as well, of like the what it means to have a cemetery in which to be buried and to know that cemetery remains sacred, right? This is a sacred, actually let's talk about the holy and the sacred in a moment, but that this is a way to actually, everyone has that allotted space and you can walk around and have communion with every presence. What does it mean when we have an Israeli state that wages war not just on the living but on the dead and on the practices of the dead the practices of the living and commemorating their dead? How do we square those two things, and what also might befall some of these figures, as you said, if this were in the greater Israel, fantasy that is playing out? How would we understand these figures in that phase?
Yeah. I mean, this just deeply makes me think about how when, you know, the act of burying a body in the ground and how that burial then renders your body a part of that earth as time goes by, and what it means to be within it and as one. A few years ago, for example, there was they found the remnants of a mass native grave in Quebec that they built a school on top of. And it's the constant colonial sort of erasure of bodies from the ground, you know, like just unmarked graves, build a parking lot, build a hotel, you know, build you know, the Trump's Gaza plan, for example, just that constant, just like building en masse graves. They, you know, they might turn the ground over in and over itself, but these bodies are a part of the ground just as much as the history that is built that beneath them is. So when there is no sort of differentiation, in my opinion, between the historical artifact and the human body that is there, and what it does to mark the history of that space. And so when I think about the South and I think about the potential of my grandparents' graves being lost, I think very much that no matter what happens, their spirit is there, and that will remain forever, no matter what the geographical lines that are drawn may look like in 100 years. And so it is that sort of, you know, reclamation and proclamation of belonging to that very land and what it means. It goes beyond a marked grave. It is a privilege to have a grave, and when I was working, obviously, on this, I could see the differences between who has a granite grave and who has a, you know, the small differences between even the type of stone that were used in the grave, but all of that doesn't necessarily even matter in the end. What matters is that there is a choice in which ground you decide to be put in. And that's why so many of the figures here, I say, wanted to be buried here, but could not. And that's something very sort of important to stand by. And whether these graves are marked or not marked, or whether they happen or not, at the very end of the day, the geography of where all of our people belong is embedded within their blood. Doesn't matter where it's buried at the end. So it's a very conscious decision. As an artist, you're constantly also thinking about how your work has to live past your own life, and whether, you know, my art is supposed to live longer than I live, right? That's the point. And so these are different markers, really. A grave or your work, they all, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess there are two directions I want to go in. I guess one is about the sacred and the holy, but actually I'm also, something you said is, which I thought was really beautiful, is that even if that ground gets overturned, the spirit, that person, the remnants of that person is part of the land and the earth, and that's their spirit. I guess there's a flip side to that, which is haunting, right? Like the way in which the dead haunt. And I'm thinking actually here of Gaza, in that there are these mass graves on graves on graves, buildings which were family homes are now graves, rubble, graves. You know, this idea of the unholy burial and the inability to bury our dead. Or the inability to keep up with our dead, and that the shroud makers can't keep up with the amount of the martyrs. And so the way in which we continue to haunt the landscape and inhabit the landscape. And I'm thinking also the connections here with the Nakba in 1948. And there are all these, I mean, there's in Palestine studies right now, there's such an interest in haunting, and how in the Israeli psyche they are haunted by those that they displaced, and they are haunted by those that they massacred in 1948. And I wonder whether now we're also witnessing this renewed haunting of the Palestinian body, which has been so mercilessly and brutally massacred, and how that intersects with graves as sites of remembrance, that we don't even have moments of remembering, or sites of remembrance because of the scale of the death. I suppose then I would love to talk about maybe what the work is trying to do, or the extent to which artist intention even matters. But I would love to talk more about like the sacred or the precious, because there is something really special for those who've been to the space. I felt a difference when you're outside the cemetery to when you're inside, and I think, particularly the drapes or the material above the head, the soundscape, the way that the wooden structures are, that it's actually kind of almost like being in the womb or something. I had this feeling of being held or supported, and that felt kind of a very spiritual thing. I'm curious about how you thought about making this also a celebration of something sacred, of something careful. You don't tread on the graves of the dead, you don't curse near the dead, you don't bring bad feeling, you bring purity and you bring cleanliness. I'm just curious about those intersections and how you might have wanted the people visiting this artwork to feel.
Yeah, I did want them to feel a sense of intimacy in the space and to have sort of their own moment, because so much of experience of viewing art feels, when you're in the white cube, it feels very, feels like a panopticon in a weird way in a museum. It's like this wide open space and you're like 100 people. And I very much wanted there to be real proximity, so it doesn't matter how many people are around you. You could have you could go through the maze and have this sort of close one-to-one in front of the grave itself, to pay homage, to mourn in your own way, to learn about them, so that it doesn't feel like a monument, even though when you step out, it is a monument, but that you feel this interiority and closeness in a way to have these, sort of sacred moments, as you say, but also, I'm always sort of interested in these different ways of mournings. In East Asia, for example, in parts of China, they burn joss money on graves to give them money in the afterlife, for example. Or in Japan, you can drink by the grave. You can have a drink and pour alcohol on the grave so that they taste it with you. So these little acts of spirituality across cultures are all very, very important. There's no one way to mourn, and there's no all of it is sacred because you are holding something in memory, whether it exists or not. And the structure of the space was meant to mimic trestles that grapes are grown on. There are so many of those across the Western Asia, and the sunken sort of roof that just forces your body to feel a certain way around it was something that I very much wanted when I was working with the architects to design this space, so that it wouldn't, so that your physicality felt very prominent in front of the work, that instead of feeling shrunk by the mass scale of it, because it is a large installation, that you felt in each sort of panel your own body is reflected. That's why all of the sheets are single bed sheets. So it's meant to be the size of a single person. And so yeah, that was just very intentional in the the sizing of it.
Can I ask then about sound and what was the thinking behind the sound design or the audio experience you wanted the visitor to feel?
Well, all cemeteries are outdoors, and being in this isn't a work that's outdoors; it's a work that's indoors. So to have just a sonic element to bring that sort of to change the way that the space feels in expanding it to hear sounds from the outside, like a bird chirping or, you know, just a bit of air. I think just adds more to the feeling of intimacy within the space, and also kind of changes, even though, you know, it's a covered trestle also in most parts, so it doesn't matter if you're indoor or outdoor, but the space here has windows, which is not something that many spaces have. So, and it has a skylight as well. So they were all meant to act together to create this feeling of being outside.
And I'm curious about the actual charcoal, because there's some you can even not just make out the names, but you can also make out emblems or, you know, like political parties or things like that, these types of affiliations. And then others, obviously, which either you couldn't find or you couldn't access for different reasons. You've got the cyanotype and the names. Did you, as an artist, did you feel a difference in whether or not you found the grave and how you related to the person?
I mean, it was really, I don't know, there's no other word that kind of comes to mind. It was just very interesting to see how different every grave looked. You imagine a form of uniformity, but there is none. There are just these different markings of a life. And I mean, I couldn't access Atala Adnan's grave, but I imagined that for it to feel the way I would have imagined for it to feel, it should have the outline of Mount Tampamale, which he really loved, for example. Like I would hope that my grave has, you know, symbols of what I loved in my life on it. Why not?
So around the grave.
No, I mean, like, just it's I thought of that. I thought of that a lot. Like in Naji Ali, you know, I hope there's a Hanzala on there. I mean, it's just maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but the image is really. I think image is quite obviously is very important. So I would hope that even though this is a show where you can see it's just language, there is not image, it's just names and writing, but the way that I was interpreting the grave was as an image. So yeah, I would like to think of that more.
No, that's beautiful. I found it, I mean, it was an interesting, as a person in the art, in the space, I found it interesting, the artworks that you could very much tell was sort of by hand and charcoaled over, and this was a reflection of someone else's design, right? So someone had designed the gravestone, whoever that was, and then this was you making a rendering of it, versus this was you having a placeholder, and the placeholder versus the charcoal. I think there's a strange mirroring to that experience, actually. Yeah, it was just an interesting observation. I suppose I want to maybe think of the artwork as a whole then, and what it means or what the process was like of having a cemetery by design as opposed to having an organic cemetery, as we were talking about earlier. So you've put these figures in conversation with one another, you've narrativized it to some degree or another, and you've put it in its nature an artificial space, which is, you know, to what extent is this then also a performance? Like, is this a performance piece and not just, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't want to overly imbue meaning to authentic. I mean, cemeteries are also inauthentic in many different ways, but this is not that, right? Like, this is a representation. So, yeah, I'm just curious as to what extent this felt like a performance piece or a piece of, yeah, I'm not sure. If that makes sense.
No, it does, because it sort of links to like just how I generally make all my work, and all the material in my work has to come from rubbings on site, which is also an act of performance in a way. You know, even if it's of a column in a temple, the act of making a charcoal rubbing of something so much bigger or so much smaller than you is in a way also like a performance. I think it's all sorts of I think the only way, I think it's an accurate way of describing it, because I don't think that my work can be read simply through what you see in the room, because the process is very much a part of it, and that's why material is so important. So I think the only way to acknowledge that the material is so specific, and that the act of making is so specific, is to look at it all together. And I guess altogether it is an act of theater in a way. I mean, my personal art goal is to do an opera one day, so maybe that explains why it looks like this. But I don't think it's, they all go together. So I think, I think that is an accurate way of describing it. Yeah.
And were you tempted to integrate or include other aspects of the cemetery that aren't just the graves? So obviously you mentioned trellises in terms of your inspiration, but you also mentioned the soundscape being one of outdoors. But, there are so many accoutrements or things that go into the graves. I mean, in Iraq, for instance, when we visited my uncle's grave, we went and washed it with rose water, and you buy rose water on the way to the cemetery from, a boy selling it on the side of the road. And then when you're in the cemetery, there's a particular ritual that comes with it. I just wonder when did you feel like this piece was finished? Not finished in terms of the people you were representing, which, as you mentioned, was infinite, but in terms of, did you ever feel the temptation to include everything else that went into our burials and into our rituals? And that so many of these figures are Arabs, Armenians, Christian, Muslim, Druze, atheists, communists, socialists, that each would have had a different approach to their deaths, maybe, culturally or otherwise. Did you feel this inclination to include other aspects of death other than just the gravestone?
That is I did, but then it would be infinite in a sense. There would be no way of marking how to stop. I think for me that came in the writing. More of that act came in the writing, because every time I visited the grave, except for those who I knew, there are figures in this show that I personally knew, but everyone else who I did not know, it was a strange conversation between me and the grave, basically, where I felt, sorry to disturb you. I'll just take 5 minutes of your time, I promise, thank you, and because it's very intimate, like, doing this, you can feel, can you imagine? I am on top, I'm hugging this person, is what it feels like, which makes it obviously very special. But because of that closeness, that act to me felt like, I was mourning them in a way, but it felt like this is what I will do to mourn you, or else it'll just be continuous. But the real, grieving and all of that thought came when I had to think about marking someone's life in a paragraph is actually really, really difficult. And especially people you do not know. And so that act of personal mourning came in the writing, but during the rubbings, it was, I felt like I was just interrupting their sleep, and so, sorry, just there is a weird sort of, I'm so sorry, thank you very much.
Did you think, again, of who might, like, I'm sure if you went to a room or Smugglers Inn equivalent in Beirut or Baghdad or Amman, you would hear different names than if you were in London or New York or, in any other geography. Everyone will have their own people who they think, no, you have to include this person. This person is foundational or seminal to the Nahda in some way. I guess, we touched on it earlier about who to include, not to include, but was there ever a feeling of like, no, this is actually my project on my terms, and I'm going to find these figures, and this is what makes sense to me in my own personhood? Or was it like, this is our collective memory, and therefore I want to pursue as many options as possible?
Well, I can only obviously act as myself, but this to me is an act of collectivity. This is my way of showing my collectivity. If people come and see the show or read the list and have ideas of who they would like to add to it. That's, I think, the work doing its job, in a sense that it's making you think about who you hold important to your own politics and to your expressions of your freedoms. And so I can only go as far as to speak for myself, but I understand that this is a collective act. And as I'm speaking for myself, I am trying to bring myself closer to the collective that I belong in, because this idea that, obviously you go through life as an individual, but the universe is a collective. We are a part of it, And so this is my way of giving everyone a hug. I suppose.
But then, it actually makes me think, when I was in year 9, I went to Ypres in Belgium, where obviously a lot of the First World War played out on the Western Front, and they have the unnamed soldier's grave, and they do this sort of every night. There's sort of a memorial of the war, and then this soldier's grave is there. And I guess the sort of democratic potential of having the unmarked grave as well, and the grave that you don't really know which body is there, but you're there. It is a collective grief of this moment that we all shared, and everyone, in a way, this unmarked grave or this unnamed soldier or unnamed person is a cipher for our own grief, right? Like that we project, we also receive solace, which is not quite the work that this project is doing at all, because actually we are honouring these individuals as individuals and their contribution to what makes us as a collective hold value. But I did find some sort of parallel, as you were talking, between the collective and the individual, in that sense that this is a curated selection of individuals who collectively have had such an impact on our movement and our legacies and the state of our world currently and how we understand the world. And also, I think, considering that it's also being shown that this show is happening in the Western world and that this government is one of the governments that is killing figures like these who are alive now, I think also has some kind of disruptive potential there. I think maybe, well, unless you have anything else to add, I'd like to turn it over to the audience.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you for presenting the work, and thank you for this great conversation. One of the things I was thinking about a little bit was around practices of working with the dead as an artist, but also in other positions. And I loved hearing about your sort of apprehension or embarrassment around offering this hug. Because one of the interesting things about working with the dead is they either can't refuse, or it's not obvious how they refuse. Maybe they do have some agency. But I was wondering if it ever became a question for you of not just who might you include, but who could refuse that, or what that power relationship.
Yeah, no, I have thought about that very much, because so when I was looking for some of the graves of the individuals, I had to ask their family members, and so obviously I had to ask permission, and but generally the fundamental. This is the interesting thing about being an artist, is that there is this understanding from those closest to these figures that what they've produced is for you, and so this life is shared. There isn't and intimate and individual moments are what people hold near and dear to themselves. So I haven't expressed anything that was shared with me in secret, in these obituaries. But there's like a understanding that, like I said, my work has to live longer than I do. So there is this double life that you spend as yourself and through your output into the world.
But also there is in one of the obituaries a description of one of the artist's niece who would go by her gravesite and just smoke with her, because she knows that's what that's how she would like to be remembered, and how she would like to. And so there is, in a way, to your question, like this bleeding. It's the artist, but it's also the artist's family and the artist's work, and then you in conversation as another artist rendering that. There is a weird mirroring there.
Yeah, that's my aunt. I'm the niece. That's me.
Oh my God, I love that. Okay. So you go and smoke by her grave to honor her?
Yeah, I told her about, I told her that I got married. Basically, I told her about my love life. She would have appreciated that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Actually, that was such a nice detail in the
thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Maybe on that stanza, there's some obituaries which show this kind of intimacy that you had with families and graves, because part of this exhibition is about history that's not recorded or history that isn't honoured, particularly within the West. And I wondered if you wanted to maybe read Paul Giragosi.
Oh, I knew you were talking about him when you said that. Yeah, this was one of the most, one of the sweetest moments in making this work. So Paul Giragossian is a Armenian, Palestinian, Lebanese painter whose family survived both the Armenian genocide and the Nakba. And when we went to do a rubbing of his grave, we realized that, funnily enough, none of us spoke Armenian or read Armenian, so we wouldn't know which grave was his in the graveyard. And I'll just read this for you. Okay. Paul Giragossian, born in 1926 in Jerusalem, Palestine, to Armenian parents who survived the Armenian genocide, died in 1993 in Beirut. Was a seminal Palestinian, Lebanese, Armenian painter whose art powerfully conveyed the human condition, identity, and the struggles of exile. Being Palestinian Armenian, Paul painted for both the Palestinian and Armenian Nakbas, while also tending through his work to the flux of the displaced, oppressed, and exiled in the vibrant neighborhoods around Jerusalem and Beirut. His vibrant canvases captured the joys, sorrows, and resilience of everyday life, transforming personal and collective memory into universal visual narratives. Paul lived a quiet and modest life. He grew up poor and only became wealthy posthumously. Even his grave exhibits signs of modesty as one of the few ones around his burial site without a marble frame, only a slab of concrete. His grave was very well tended with fresh flowers and a lot of different flower pots. When asked about them, the gravedigger said that the man with the dog comes to visit him every single week, waters the plants, lights a candle, and leaves him fresh flowers. It's been over 30 years since Paul passed away. So we didn't know which grave was his, but when we asked, he said, "You'll know it when you see it. It's covered in flowers." And it just sort of really almost immediately stood up as this beautiful shrine. And everyone asks who the man with the dog is, but I didn't want to ask. I felt that that was enough of an answer, really.
I guess if I can, just a related question then is how did you find for the graves you were able to locate? How did you find them, and what did you feel when you were there?
Well, in Beirut, we don't have that many graveyards, and people are buried according to their religious denominations, so there are only like a couple of graveyards that we could go to. So we really looked around, basically, was the job. But most are buried in the Cemetery of Martyrs. That is a huge central cemetery in Beirut. It felt we don't have any public parks in Beirut, and actually it felt like the only space of fresh air, and it felt as close as a park as I could get to. It was very we enjoyed it doing, and I didn't go on my own, but it always felt like a sweet day well spent, outside, and lots of cats sleeping on graves. There are photos of those. So yeah, it's yeah.
And did you ever experience a kind of grief at some graves and joy at others, for instance, or was it not that kind of relationship?
No, I grieved when I went to my aunt's grave, yeah, for sure, because I hadn't gone back since she had passed away. So in my smoking a cigarette and telling her about my life, I was also crying throughout it. So yeah.
Because I ask, because I have an ancestor buried in northern Palestine. He was a very prominent, I don't know, figure in the 19th century, and in this Palestinian town, which is now part of Israel, there's the Christian cemetery and the Muslim cemetery, and he's buried in the Muslim cemetery, and it's a very big grave. But I thought I'd read all these academic articles about him and had done all this research, and it's my field work, and I kind of marketed this trip to this grave to my friends who came with me as like this big event, and then we got there, I was a bit like, that I didn't have this moment that I was in my head building up to, and I thought it's funny that. I mean, what is a grave actually, really? Like, is it, and who's it for? Is it for honorably burying someone, or is it for you to have somewhere to go to? And if you didn't know that person, how do you relate to that space as well, I guess? It makes me think of people who make pilgrimages to Mark's grave in Hampstead Heath and stuff like, this person with the dog, is this person a relative? Is this person a stranger? And how do you relate to the resting place of someone who is no longer living but whose work you feel familiar with? I mean, this is, yeah.
I mean, I wish Khalil Hawi had a grave. I would visit it.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. Apologies, my first time seeing your work, so this might be a very obvious question, but what made you choose cloth as the medium for translating the rubbings rather than paper, or then translating it onto something else? Was it a practical thing, or was it to convey the vision you wanted at the end with the cemetery? I'm just interested to know.
Yeah, I always work with cloth. There are multiple reasons for it. The first one is because I don't have a fixed studio and all of my works are based on different sites. So you can fold a piece of cloth and put it in a backpack and go do a rubbing and then fold it back in. And for a very long time before I had, a artistic career, so to speak, many of my artworks used to travel in different suitcases from Lebanon to wherever the show was. So cloth is the sort of easiest thing to move, but also because I would use a lot of personal cloths. So in certain works I have, curtains from my grandparents' house, pillowcases from my best friend's house, silk from when my great-grandmother got married from her home. So there's a lot of, historical personal meaning, and that's within different forms of cloth and the materials that I've used in works, and also because I dye fabric, I dye material basically, or I imbue them with different materials. So cloth, the grid of the cloth acts, to me is as it holds all of these different materials within it. So there are many reasons. I also painter, canvas, and so I could give you lots of reasons. You're gonna see me using cloth forever. That's the only thing I'll say basically.
But also the shroud, right? Like, I mean, that was what I thought. When I was seeing the material as someone who doesn't make art like that, I was like, oh, this is obviously because we wash. Then we wrap the body in camphor, and I was like, oh, this is a way to bury the body and then reignite the body in a way. But I hadn't even thought about its practical functions.
No, I mean, it's also we adorn ourselves. I think very much about jewelry in that sense that the way that you my earrings are from my great aunt, for example, and how you decorate yourself with these little objects that have all of this like personal meaning. And so there is that with fabric. When I say specifically, like, so much of them come from homes of my loved ones. So I always I always say, to people I really care about, give me a piece of cloth, I'll put it in the work.
Sorry to double ask, if anyone does, please. I was thinking that your disposition as an artist in relation to these graves is quite loving in this piece, and it's about, and then I was thinking about sort of the number of interventions on monuments. I think maybe more monuments than graves, in a kind of post-BLM moment. And I was wondering if you would ever consider or be interested in a more antagonistic relationship with certain graves, interrupting, or another kind of, or that, not be conceivable or of interest.
No, thank you for that question, actually, because I was in LA in November and I saw the monuments show, actually, and I really loved it.
What is that show? Sorry.
So, it's all of the civil, all of the I'm blanking at the word. The all of the Confederate monuments around the states, they were taking them down basically, and so artists took these structures and made interventions on them. So I saw the one at the Brick that was by, God, I'm blanking at the name, sorry. Basically, the artist sort of took the granite base and carved the stars into them and turned the figure into just like a laser cut it and turned it into a completely different structure. That's interesting. That's a really interesting question. I think that, well, all of my work has been more of these loving interventions, if I could say, on the spaces and in the histories. Only because, so this is, because I feel so much of the history of Western Asia has been taken away from us or unclaimed or trying to be reclaimed, and so so my job is to, through the work to find and take care of these pieces because they are being taken away from us. So that constant, these interventions of breaking them down is what I see so much of, that this is why I'm trying to do something else with my work. So I wouldn't, but but that's, was it like 2 years ago, the Balfour's portrait, they threw red paint on it, for example, here at the university. All of these, or like throwing, canned soup at art. Those are all valid. But I'm not doing that because I'm seeing the opposite in my own history that I feel needs to be. I see so much of my history being reduced to a ruin that my job is to excavate that rather than to pulverize something. But yeah.
I think there's also, something I felt experiencing the piece was that you were giving them their dues. Like it felt like an act of respect and an act of like honoring these figures who have like dictated how we think and how we resist and how we interpret the moment that we're in. And I think because again, I just think because of this moment of like, I don't know if anyone's been seeing the footage over the last few days of just these towns, the towns and villages in southern Lebanon just being totally flattened. These war crime after war crime after war crime. To think that actually, the excavation, I think there's beauty and there's reclamation to it, like that we could recreate maybe or restructure or reimagine where these people rightfully belong. There is something empowering about that.
I've just been thinking about whose role is it to kind of create these maps of these sites of remembrance, and often that falls onto the artists, falls onto kind of creatives to sort of speak about this. And is that necessarily
how do you move on from this work? Where do you kind of, we talked about it being a continuation, but how do you distance yourself from it, kind of politically and personally?
I don't know if I ever particularly could, because all of my work, I think very much that you can't look at anyone's work through a single work. You have to look at the whole body, really. And so for me, this work goes all the way back to one of the earliest works that I've done. They're all sort of linked together in a way, and from each work to work, I'm exploring ways to grow differently with the works and take these tools and keep using them. And so I don't think that they're I don't distance myself from anything that I've done in that sense. They all go together, and I'm doing them to learn from them. But like I said in the very beginning, I did this for a very particular reason during a very particular time in my life, which still applies. So for me, when like you said, the villages in southern Lebanon, when I see my great-grandparents' house that's now been reduced to rubble, and how painful that experience is, but the history of my village and my family being erased and reduced to dust, the only silver lining that I have in my mind is that through my experience as an artist and in my practice of making art, I've garnered the tools to keep turning these intangible moments into tangible spaces through my work. So as heavy as the loss that I am experiencing, I know that through the work I've done, I found ways to continue, living my life with these things near to me, no matter what happens politically.
No, but I think actually, sorry, just as a final reflection, I think it's really special. Like, I think that yes, this is about death, but it's also about beauty and curation and love and honoring, and we have fewer and fewer opportunities to do that because we're just seeing the most depraved moments of human civilization playing out right now. And to just create this, these studios that just hold our ancestors with such grace is really an act of resistance and beauty. So yatik al-afia, thank you.
Thank you. That's, thank you.
And thank you all for coming out.